Hi, my name is Jeff Miller. I'm the theory section chair for the New York State Political Science Association. I'm also the panel chair for this session on political theory, and I'm very happy to have with us today three scholars, three very interesting papers that they're going to explain to you a little bit. We're going to listen to what they have to say about these things in this order. We're going to have Jeff Kurtz go first. We're going to have Anastasia Kalk go second, and Spiros Makris go third, and then I'll have some remarks at the end. So Jeffrey Kurtz, if you'd like to lead us off.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. My paper is titled The Intellectual History of Realignment Socialism and Why It Matters. It's part of an ongoing larger project looking at democratic socialist thought in America. And part of what is maybe peculiar about this as a scholarly project is that I'm not examining, at least not in this paper, in this part of the project, I'm not examining the works of scholars. I'm not looking at academic political theory, although some other parts of the project are going to involve that a bit more. Excuse me, excuse me. I'm writing about people who are thinkers, but not, but on the margins of the academic world. And one of the themes that I am thinking about in the larger project, which comes through in a few ways in this particular paper, is that it seems to me that there has, from the very beginning, from Robert Owen onwards, there's been a tension within socialist political thought in terms of the attitude that socialist thinkers have toward modernity as a whole. Necessarily, a political project that we describe as socialist is a criticism of at least some aspects of modern society and modern life, modern thought. But the tension is whether socialism as a political movement or as an intellectual tradition is criticizing some aspects of modernity on the basis of some other aspects of modernity, whether it's a modern critique of modern life, or whether there's a more fundamentally, I don't know what to call it, anti-modern, non-modern, pre-modern impetus and intellectual framework involved. And I think that, although I don't put it exactly that way within this paper, I hope as I'm describing the paper, it'll be clear that it's that larger tension is a lot of what I'm interested in here. All right, so the specific aspect of American left thought that I'm looking at in this paper is the idea of political party realignment as a strategy deliberately adopted by some American democratic socialists in and around the 1960s. And what I try to do in the paper is show the trajectory, the development of that idea between the 1960s and the 1980s, looking especially at the writings of Michael Harrington, but also at some other people along the way. So what I want to do in the next few minutes, I guess, is to talk about realignment socialism, or as the idea emerged in the 1960s, talk a little bit about how it had changed or how it appeared differently by the 1980s, and then talk about what I think that shift indicates as far as the intellectual lessons that come from this political tendency. So in the 1960s, there was a group of, or a circle of political thinkers, many of them associated with the Socialist Party of America, who advocated a shift away from the political strategy that American socialists had usually adopted in the past, which was the strategy of having an independent political party of their own, fielding its own candidates, competing against Democrats and Republicans and other parties. By the 60s, thinkers like Michael Harrington, Bayard Rustin, who was the chief organizer of the 1963 March on Washington, and various others had come to think that, borrowing a term from political science, a realignment of the two-party system provided them a deliberate realignment, a strategy of realignment, provided them with a better strategy. And from the beginning, there were, I would say, certainly a number of different components of this idea. Realignment socialism in the 1960s was a bundle or cluster of ideas. And that's an important point to jump around a little bit here. Pardon me for jumping. It's an important point to remember that this was a bundle of ideas, because when journalists and commentators in the past few years have returned to this idea of realignment, they've often, I think, misconstrued it as being simply a matter of, as people often say, moving the Democrats to the left or something like this. And that's not entirely wrong, but the bundle of ideas was, first of all, the goal of turning the Democratic Party into a more programmatic, ideologically unified political party, something like what the American Political Science Association's famous Responsible Parties paper was calling for. Second, that this more programmatic Democratic Party would have a specifically left of center political program, not necessarily a socialist political program, but one that a broad sector of socialists and progressives and liberals could agree on. Third, that it would be a Democratic Party with a different voter base, shedding the Southern white conservatives and drawing in independent and moderate to liberal Republican voters. And then third, the idea that the Democratic Party would be anchored by a coalition between the labor movement, the civil rights movement, and organized liberal groups. That's, of course, the coalition that debuted in a dramatic way in the 1963 March on Washington. For realignment, socialist realignment thinkers in the 1960s, the important thing about this package of ideas was that there was a clear sense of what was for the sake of what. The goal was dramatic policy change, enacting a certain political program, coalition politics, coalescing the constituencies of the labor, civil rights, and liberal movements, was a means toward the end of building a majority, a voting majority big enough to enact those policies. Harrington writes almost apologetically about coalition politics in the 1960s, wistfully wishing that a unified working class, the old socialist dream of a unified working class, wishing that was available, and seeing this cross-class coalition as a kind of second best, the best we can do in real life. So that's 1960s realignment socialism. In the 1970s, of course, with the election and then re-election of Richard Nixon, things aren't looking so good for this political project. The Carter administration, frankly, isn't much better, despite its initial opening toward more left-wing policies like full employment. And then in the 1980s, advocates of this approach are, it seems to me, really shattered by the election and then re-election of Ronald Reagan. The hope that just with a little more time, a few more tries, they could reassemble the March on Washington coalition as an electoral coalition seemed by the mid-80s, by Reagan's re-election in 84, to be something that would never happen. And so Harrington and a number of other thinkers in those circles write in the mid-80s that they think that there, again, borrowing a term from political science, that there has been a de-alignment. Harrington recognizes by the mid-80s that it's not just that the Democratic Party is not a programmatic party, it's also that it's hardly an organization at all anymore. And so Harrington writes, I'm going to, this is in the late 80s, recollecting his thoughts in 1984, he says, in America, which was in an even more individualistic mood than usual, organizations per se were less important than political commercials on television that treated candidates like breakfast food. Computerized polling data about public attitudes had become much more compelling than the candidates' political instincts or reports from the precinct captains. We had based so much of our work on the assumption of the emergence of a quasi-rational party system. It's possible that America will become a nation, not simply without parties in the European sense, but without parties in the American sense as well. So that list of complaints about American politics in the 80s, of course, is hardly unique to Michael Harrington. But in the context of the political project he'd been working on, and in the paper I add some other some thoughts from related thinkers in that circle to show that it's not just Harrington who's thinking this. it sheds a different light on what the realignment socialists had been doing all along. In the mid and late 80s, he dies in 1989, Harrington and some other people in his circles become increasingly concerned about what one of his associates, Irving Howe, calls public life. They seem to see, although I don't think any of them ever put it in quite the way I'm about to, that all along this work of building coalitions of organized constituencies had an importance beyond its instrumental value as a means toward policy change. That what they had been doing in trying to foster this kind of labor, civil rights, liberal coalition was building a model of public life in which people experience what I would call layered memberships. You're a member of a small local group that's affiliated with something larger, that is allied with or coalesced with other groups into something still larger. And that kind of layered membership where you have both relatively intimate face-to-face gatherings that are connected with possibly a majority coalition with larger formations, is a model of political life different from what you get, for example, with the model of political professionals amalgamating or aggregating unorganized voters into a voting mass. So in retrospect, I think the realignment socialist tradition takes on a different light. The work of coalition building was more than just a means to an end. And I think, do I have a little time left, Jeff? I don't want to go over too long. Okay. If you look back at the intellectual origins of realignment socialism, you can notice some themes that were kind of there within the circles of people who were talking, within the political circles who were talking about realignment. Themes that were present in their thinking all along, but that got kind of, that drifted to the side. Some of the people in the Socialist Party and related organizations in the 50s who launched this idea of realignment as a strategy for socialists had been involved in the 1940s in a reassessment of the Soviet Union, that good old left-wing question, what is the nature of the Soviet Union? In which they turned away from Marxist categories like socialism and capitalism and found that they needed political concepts like bureaucracy in order to analyze the nature of the Soviet Union. Some of the people involved in those circles in the 1950s and 60s were interested in, cautiously interested in, the mass culture or mass society critiques that some theorists developed in those years. Irving Howe, in particular, who was the editor of Dissent, the intellectual journal most closely associated with this political stream, has this wonderful 1965 lecture where he talks about the realignment socialist strategy and the mass society critique as these two things that you need both of them. They don't fit easily together, he thinks, but you somehow need to combine them. And still in that essay, even though he says that they're parallel but separate political ideas, he does end up blending them in some ways. He writes about the way that in a mass society, political parties, as well as the tradition, what he calls the traditional loyalties and ties on which political relationships are based, all tend to atrophy. So my sense is, what I try to show in this paper, is that considering the worries about de-alignment that Harrington and allied thinkers have by the mid-80s, and thinking about their previous decades of political work in light of those conclusions that they reached, and thinking about the ideas that were present in their political circles at the beginning of this process of thought in the 40s and 50s, you can get the sense that throughout this 30 or so year tradition of realignment socialism, there was always a tension between the idea that coalition building has a purely instrumental value as a means toward massive policy change, and on the other hand, the sense that coalition politics and the political model of layered membership is a response to mass society. It's a response to problems that social and political problems that the word capitalism does not adequately describe. And the lesson or consequence of this political tradition, it seems to me, contrary to what some commentators on this tradition have said in recent years, is that if you look at the realignment socialism with an eye toward those two things, the original circle of ideas and the worries that some of these thinkers arrived at by the 80s, the lesson, the political implications for our time seem to me to point to a politics that's less polarizing and less ideological, not a matter of moving the Democratic Party to the left, as people often say, but rebuilding a connection between large-scale political formations like political parties and smaller scale, more intimate formations like locally organized groups. That's probably a good enough place to stop.
That was great. Thanks very much, Jeff. I really appreciate it. Looking forward to chatting with you about that. Next up, we have Anastasia Kalk. She's from the New School for Social Research, and her paper is titled Political Theory of Communes, Socialist Critique after Fourier.
I have a couple of slides. They're not really very informative, but I think they can probably help to clarify. Let me see if I can show them. Okay, I can do it without presentation, without slides, it's fine. So my paper is a part of the larger project that is the reconstruction of the history of the political idea of communes in, I would say, like global political history that is not entirely limited to the history of France or to the history of Soviet Union or even to the history of like India. So these are the places where the ideas of commune were developed and discussed maybe like more intensely than say in the US. And this is like a very interesting question in itself, like what does the idea of commune mean in the US political history? And I hope like we'll have some time probably to talk about this. As you could probably see, I think our paper, like Jeff's paper and mine, they do have something in common, which is that like desire to understand what socialism could mean in our contemporary society and what like the socialist program could look like, and what are the types of demands that are like historically and politically associated with this like term or this ideology of socialism. So this is again like this is the goal to clarify the meaning of socialism for, I would say, like political theory at first, like not necessarily for like contemporary political movements. So the goal is pretty modest here. Nevertheless, I like the paper is based on the assumption that like the ideas of socialism or the ideology of socialism is getting more popular than it was say like 20 or 30 years ago after the fall of the Soviet Union. So now it might be the time to like ask that question again and to pose that question again, the question about the difference between socialism and liberalism, socialist and liberal ideas. I think it's one of the most important political questions of the moment. So over the last 20 years, political thinkers, they have criticized different political and economic structures. They revealed their lack of political participation, abundance of systematic inequality, promotion of private individualism. And usually as a remedy to all of these issues, democratic scholars, political scholars in general, they propose to increase political involvement by uniting in what different thinkers call communities, councils, commons, sometimes communes. In truly democratic societies, as the scholars explain, people should experience that intense commonality in their both like everyday life and political lives than they do under liberal or neoliberal democracy. Communist philosophy too has celebrated the idea of a self-governing community or commune as the kind of like main revolutionary answer to neoliberal capitalism. same utopian dreams about self-sufficient communities could be found in a lot of debates on post-colonialism and anti-colonialism. So in general, like these two ideas, like both communes and communities, they are, you know, circulated as a kind of like universally positive terms that everyone, you know, supports and everyone agrees with. However, this like theoretical question of what does it mean, right? Like to build the society that is composed of communes, or that is composed of communities, that like simple question, like as simple as it sounds, it was not necessarily posed in that formulation. So I'm trying to, in order to clarify the meaning of socialism and the meaning of that historical tradition, I try to create that kind of like trajectory that the idea of commune has been, you know, experienced, beginning from the French Revolution, with the 19th century discussions on the meaning of that post-revolutionary society. Particularly, I focus on Charles Fourier and critique of Fourier by Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Kropotkin a little bit later, at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. You saw, if you saw the paper, you probably saw that I talk a lot, I discuss a lot of the ideas that come from the experience of the early Soviet Union, which is represented by Alexandra Kollontai. And then I talk about anti-colonial interpretations of commune by Gandhi. So here, for the purposes of this meeting, I just want to focus on only like first parts of the paper, which is the reconstruction of the idea of communes after the French Revolution, related to the experience of the Paris Commune. So still in our contemporary imagination, in our contemporary political language, the term commune is not very popular. So we tend to use and like apply the other like universally praised term community that describes existing social relations and people's groups under our like contemporary societies, while the other term commune has that very negative, almost like revolutionary power to oppose the entire like institutional system, to oppose the modern idea of the family, modern idea of the state, isolation, or like this division between human and nature. It's also part of the critique that comes together with the term commune in our contemporary political language. So to sum up, right, compared to community, the concept of commune carries that like political power to oppose the system of modern political institutions, or the political institutions that were like discovered in the modern period. I would say that, like, according to my own investigation, or like to my own research, that like strong association between like commune on the one hand and like revolutionary socialism on the other was born exactly after the experience, or like after the event of the Paris Commune in 1871. It did not exist before. So commune was a very typical name for a unit of local governance in France that was not associated with like revolutionary socialist changes, that it, you know, kind of like started to be connected with after the Paris Commune and after like particular like theoretical interpretation of that experience by Marx and then Lenin. So it was like, I think it's pretty safe to argue that it was these were first like Marx, Engels, Kropotkin, maybe Lenin later, who connected the ideas of socialism and communism with the idea of commune. So like communism, like the way it was used before, it did not imply the destruction of the centralized state and the creation of this like new local like institutions that are called like communes. Like the word had a little bit different meaning, and I would be happy to talk more about this. So how, right? Like how did communes become revolutionary? I think there was like another step towards this process, which could be found in the post-revolutionary works of Charles Fourier. His discussion of agricultural association in particular, it shaped later communal imaginaries of Marx and Engels and became one of the starting points for their attempts to determine the program, the socialist program. So in that work that is called Theory of the Four Movement and published in 1808, Fourier formulates his critique of the modern social system or civilization. He doesn't say like Western civilization, usually the term civilization. And that neglected work, I think, provides one of the early examples of anti-capitalist criticism. So modern civilization, according to Fourier, developed into the fundamentally flawed order. Its first catastrophe comes from egotism, like growing egotism or individualism. Civilization celebrates the idea of self-interested individual. It destroys natural human passion for unity, confining people into their like egotistic selves. So the second striking phenomenon, modern phenomenon that this work confronts is an isolated household or nuclear family. Fourier famously argues that the institution of private households oppresses women by imprisoning them in this like houses or like in this like marriage unions that subjugates, like the institution itself of marriage subjugates women to their husbands. And this like deeply unfree union contradicts the idea of human progress. So that was like the initial critique that Fourier develops in his work. So here we see this like three objects of socialist criticism that will travel like through the 20th century. So first is like modern egotism or individualism. Second is the idea of the nuclear family. And then third, civilization or market economy. I didn't say much about this, but so he basically criticizes the commercial like desire of like modern peoples. They will reappear, all these like three objects of criticism will reappear in the writings of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Kallenstein a century later. And I would say like the tradition of socialist critique derives from this like three parts, like from three elements of socialist criticism. The only difference between the earlier Fourierist understanding of phalanxes or like agricultural association and the later Marxist idea about like revolutionary commune, like the main like difference between these two say like political projects or these two social projects was in their relation to the institution of the state. So Fourier, as we remember from Marx and Engels, does not criticize modern states. He's not critical of like parliamentarism, of the lack of democratic participation in the like centralized modern state institutions. In fact, he tries to avoid that question and tries to think about like socialism in this like anti-political almost mode. And this is exactly the reason why some of his followers later interpret his like proposal in that like anti-political manner. We remember that in the 19th century, Fourier inspired like a pretty vibrant movement of like new private associations and communities whose members decided to quietly reform their everyday lives. So it evoked that private movement of like private experiments on the one hand. On the other, it also influenced the achievements and the inventions of the Paris Commune in 1871. So his critique of the isolated household, it gave rise to one of the most, I would say, like, important and major commune's inventions, which was the institution of public nurseries. Marx and Lenin did not necessarily write about that part in their analysis of the Paris Commune. They kind of like downplayed it in their own interpretation of the kind of like achievements of the Paris Commune. But yet it was like one of the main, at that period, it was one of the main discovery or like invention that was associated with the experience of the Paris Commune. So when they describe, okay, like I do have a couple more minutes probably, right? Or, okay, so I'm trying to summarize here. So when Marx, Lenin, and Kropotkin, they describe the experience of the Paris Commune, they focus on its direct democratic attack on the liberal state. They connect this idea to the critique of liberal democracy, or like liberal parliamentarism, originated from Latin communis, a French commune. It used to name any group of people sharing common life between the 13th and 18th century. This meaning was not, like, it was politically close to what we today would call a village. Compared to association, for example, like a voluntary unity of people, like this was another popular term of the time, like a commune rarely defined a conscious and rebellious social organization in the 19th century. However, like after the Paris Commune and after the civil war in France, the term got this like revolutionary, radical interpretation that it still like carries with it up to the present moment. As a result of this event and its revolutionary interpretation, the rather neutral term had absorbed multiple strands of anti-capitalist socialist criticism that I just like mentioned. So the critique of individualism, the critique of isolated households, modern states, right, and market economy. So we have four. At the end of this story, we have four parts or four like elements of socialist critique associated with the idea of the commune. The same process had never happened to, say, like another concept of community. And in contrast to communes, communities, they continue describing the words, like the human groups as they are, right? So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anastasia. Very interesting. Thank you for the presentation. Last but not least, we have Spiros Makris from the University of Macedonia. His paper is titled "Philosophy as a Way of Life and the Nature of the Political, the Problem of Socrates and Leo Strauss's Thought." Spiros, take it away.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Without further ado, I'm going straight to my paper, to my topic. In order someone to grasp Strauss' political thought, both theological political problem, the problem of the crisis of modernity as crisis of our time, crisis of the West, or crisis of liberal democracy, we must systematically and thoroughly go through the fundamental problem of Socrates, as you said. In other words, we have to immerse ourselves in what he defines, Leo Strauss, as classical political rationalism, in the hard core of which dominates the grand project of classical political philosophy as a rival to modern political philosophy in the sense of Machiavellian political science. At the heart of this rationalism dominates the finger of Socrates, and especially the investigation of the political way through which Socrates deals with the constitutive question of the meaning and position of the divine in human life and the city. In Strauss' entire work, so to speak, specific corpus of articles and books stands out, in which the German Jewish thinker raises and or analyzes Socratic issues with his distinctive reading style, tracing the life as well as the tragic death of Socrates through the most important texts of the ancient Greek literature. Socratic life reveals the tension between philosophy, theology, and politics, and especially the fragile relationship between philosophical and political life, which in the unique case of Socrates is not a simple fact, of course, but the statutory act of the genesis of the political philosophy herself. It was not Aristotle, Strauss writes in The City and Man, a famous book of him, but Socrates who originated political philosophy. In his book called Socrates and Aristophanes, he underlines in the same logic, I quote, "Political philosophy was founded by Socrates," end of quote. On tyranny and the restatement on Xenophon's Hero, another very famous book of him, he released it in 1959, if I'm not wrong, delimit the problem of Socrates to a large extent. At the heart of Strauss' political thought is Socrates not as an archetypal, so to speak, figure, but as a critical question that reflects the very essence of classical political philosophy herself. Strauss opposes Socratic political life in Machiavellian science, political science, arguing that while in Socratic rhetoric, the question of human freedom acquires the characteristics of virtue, in Machiavellian political science, power tends to be identified with tyranny. The trauma of the trial and death of Socrates dominates Strauss' thought as well as Plato's political philosophy. Strauss contrasts Socrates, which explicitly distinguishes him from the sophists, with tyranny and even democracy, and this is very, very strange, in the sense that leaders, and especially tyrants, often persecute and exterminate philosophers out of envy and suspicion, and due to the freedom of thought and virtue that a wise man brings to the city. For the German Jewish thinker, Machiavelli is a tangible example in the long tradition of Western political thought of how one can become a teacher and inspirer of tyrants by cutting politics off from ethics. The victory of the wise over the tyrant take place with words, that is, with persuasion. Socrates represents political prudence and virtue. The central point of politics against tyranny lies in the concept of violence. Politics is based on the will of the citizens without violence and in accordance with the laws of the city. Political freedom is a function of obedience to the law. Socrates realizes freedom as a virtue and vice versa, for the sake of the city, the laws, and the public interest. Socratic justice is synonymous, let's say, with law enforcement and civil legitimacy. Strauss does not shy away from raising the problem of Socrates as a problem between vita activa and vita contemplativa, as we say in Latin terms. In a sense, Strauss, throughout his life, mainly from 1937 onwards in the USA, when he began to deal systematically with the ancient Greek philosophy, tries desperately to solve the problem of the relationship between philosophy and politics, which in a way is reflected within the broader context of the theologico-political problem, or in other words, by incorporating the latter into the problematique that he develops from the rebirth of the classical political philosophy. Socrates represents not just wisdom and virtue, but the philosopher-citizen who stands as an ideal milestone in relation to politics as the art of governing. Understandably, the death of Socrates hurts the relationship between philosophy and politics, putting the philosopher under persecution by the city. To the extent that politics threatens philosophy with extermination, Strauss, possibly paving the way here for Jacques Derrida's relevant analysis, strongly argues that the philosopher is transformed into a foreigner, symbolizing the arrival of strangeness in the city. Strauss' thought reaches the limits of a political phenomenology, which is, for me, not far from Emmanuel Levinas's thought, for example. At this point, Strauss' position in favor of an ancient liberalism in the sense of the wise Socrates, of course, which acquires an ontological value towards the city's dominance, is also traced here. For Strauss, this almost ontological and epistemological tension between philosophy and politics is unresolved. This is another very interesting and critical point of his political thought. In contrast, for example, to the well-known Hegelian thinker and philosopher Alexander Konzev, who takes philosophy as a pure knowledge. Strauss, with Socrates and Plato at his point of reference, sees philosophy as a questioning ad infinitum, in perpetuity to infinity, in other words. Philosophy is by definition skeptical and zetetic. This revolutionary character of philosophy is sometimes perceived by the power as a threat or even sabotage. However, when philosophy loses this aporetic character, then according to Strauss, it is transformed into dogmatism or ideology, as is the case with modern political philosophy, as he claims in the most of his opus. Consequently, the dynamic, intense, and tragic relationship between philosophy and politics is transformed into political philosophy, or philosophic politics is another one terminology here, to the extent that the philosopher, like Socrates, settles in the city, moves within the city walls, metaphorically and poetically in the Platonic cave, and ultimately sacrifices his life for the city, which prosecutes and kills him, taking his philosophical discourse as an explicit manifestation of disrespect to her gods. This point highlights Strauss' dual approach, the fact that in ancient liberalism, both the city and the individual are two realities that, although opposed, must coexist for the benefit of the polis herself. This inextricably tragic element of politics, lato sensu, has been pointed out by all modern thinkers of the archetypal model of the ancient Greek city, including, for example, the Greek philosopher Cornelius Castoriadis, who characteristically emphasizes that the fierce conflict between the crowd of democratic Athens and the philosophical wisdom in the face of Socrates brings to the fore the ontotheological tragedy, he says, of the city per se. Very nice. Strauss summarizes the theologico-political problem and consequently the question of the critical relation of philosophy with the city in his famous restatement on Xenophon's Hiero, where he first clarifies in a very detailed way that classical political philosophy is clearly different from modern political philosophy, and in particular its ancestor, Machiavellian political science, to the extent that it does not separate wisdom from phronesis. And we know that phronesis in Greek, comes from Aristotle. Phronesis is the prudence, according to Aristotle, and it is the basic virtue, according to Aristotle. Phronesis. The so-called classical writing is for the German Jewish thinker a monument of moderation, temperance, kindness, and calmness. This can also be a complete definition of philosophy herself as a love of wisdom. Classical political philosophy highlights a specific kind of life, that is, a way of life that is devoted to wisdom and virtue. This, however, is an ethical framework of philosophical discussion as a perpetual search for knowledge and truth, which, according to Strauss, here too the model of a liberal republicanism may unfold that is not so far from Hannah Arendt's republicanism, cannot be developed in the absence of the city, since it presupposes both friendship, which is another very well-known Aristotelian concept, both friendship and the existence of the market, which is agora, as we know, that is of equal citizens and a common sense view of political things. I don't know, Jeff, do I have some time more?
Sure, you can take a couple more minutes.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much, sir. The presence of philosophy in the city signals the essence of political action. This absolutely dynamic, intense, and sometimes tragic condition of coexistence of philosophy and city is embodied in the statutory forms of Socrates, Al-Farabi, and Maimonides, and represents from Strauss an endless and indissoluble struggle between the totalization of power and the need at the same time for the philosophy to question the political ontology and axiology themselves, without this being perceived as disobedience and or disrespect towards the divine and metaphysical origins of the city, if I can say so. Thus, in a sense, the theologico-political problem has never ceased to be at the heart of the work of the German Jewish thinker in either the Weimar or the American phase of his thought. For Strauss, Xenophon, especially Xenophon, as a historian, objectively portrays the public image, the words, and the deeds of Socrates, focusing on two critical points. Firstly, Socrates puts at the center of the philosopher's relationship with the city the major stake of justice as the highest civic virtue. Secondly, Socrates, with his public presence, consolidates this sense of justice through the equal virtue of friendship, making himself beneficial to his associates and to society in general. Thus, in the Socratic writings of Xenophon, Strauss resolves in a way the complicated Gordian knot, so to speak, of a supposedly ungodly and impious Socrates, who supposedly corrupts the young and insults the gods of ancient Athens. Focuses on Xenophon's memorabilia, Strauss analyzes in detail the virtue of Socratic life as the preeminent life of the philosopher in the city and the market, which he likens to the life of a gentleman. Very nice. Especially justice, sobriety, wisdom, piety, and friendship. The so-called Socratic daemonium or daemonion is set as a whole on the theological framework, which assembles the Socratic philosophical and political virtues as a solid corpus, let's say vita activa plus vita contemplativa, and largely symbolizes Socrates' piety as a kind of a constant and courageous questioning of divine and human affairs. Therefore, for Strauss, Socrates' life in the city not only does not corrupt his fellow citizens and does not lead to impiety, but on the contrary, sets the established conditions for a just and happy life, eudaimonic life in Aristotelian terms. So about all Socrates' exceptional virtues, Strauss emphasizes bravery as an alloy of kindness and wisdom. So if I have 1 or 2 minutes more, Jeff, I could say some things more. I don't know. It's up to you.
How about 1 more minute, and then we can.
Okay. I'll try to say some things in order of a small summary here. So let's say here that the most critical problem from Strauss is not philosophy in the sense of an academic discipline, but philosophizing. Sometimes it reminds me the way that Martin Heidegger, for example, approaches the same thing. So philosophizing seems to be the highest virtue, and probably Socrates is the personification of this kind of philosophizing. So classical political philosophy, which is the main topic from Strauss, is liberal. In that sense, he speaks, as I said earlier, he speaks about an ancient liberalism, is liberal in the true sense of the word. And this is very, very critical for me. This is a very interesting point for further analysis, if you want. What is the difference between this kind of ancient liberalism compared to the so-called modern liberalism and so on? So Socratic, and this is my last word, Socratic moderation, and especially Phronesis, compose the solid basis of classical political philosophy. Philosophy, writes Strauss, is primarily a political philosophy. This is very interesting as well, because political philosophy is a field of ontotheological protection of human dignity, and especially of the inner sanctum of philosophy per se. Thanks a lot.
Great, thanks very much. That point about ancient liberalism, I want to come back to that in my comments because I had some questions about that. It was very provocative. Thanks to all of you for really excellent papers, and I should say for the watching audience here, we're recording this a week before the conference itself, so everybody had to have their papers done early. Everybody had to circulate their papers early, and everything went really smoothly. And I had a quite good time reading these papers. They really kind of hit a lot of marks for me. Some of the topics I'm very familiar with. Spiros's work, things he's interested in are similar things to the ones that I'm directly interested in. Some of the work was very new to me. Kurtz's work, especially with Harrington, I know very little about Harrington. And then Anastasia's kind of in the middle. I know something about the idea of the commune, the revolutionary commune, but I learned from her papers. So this was a fun grouping of papers to read. I have some formal comments about each of them. I'll go through, and maybe just 1 or 2 questions for each of you. You can pick those up as you like in the discussion as we go through. So I'll talk about them in the order that they appeared today. So Jeffrey Kurtz, The Intellectual History of Realignment Socialism and Why It Matters. I like that why it matters parts. That seems very important to me, right? Kurtz traces the development, the evolution, the changing understanding, the goals of realignment socialism, mostly through the work of Michael Harrington, who I mentioned before. I confess to knowing only peripherally, but the paper was interesting for me for that matter, right? And I think it's also interesting to me because the story Kurtz tells about Harrington's shift in views brings into focus a trajectory that seems to me to be both familiar and reinforced by lots of other evidence that Kurtz doesn't necessarily bring to bear on the topic in this very interesting paper. I think he mentioned a couple of hints of thinking about it in his presentation, but I'd be curious to hear more about that, right? So not to simplify too much, Kurtz shows how realignment socialism starts out in the 1950s with a sort of Marxist inflected, and I mean this very generally, class-based leftist focus, seeking to organize one of the two main political parties in the United States such that it can cut through the Madisonian vision of endless bargaining and coalition building and pursue a coherent, progressive, maybe even a radical agenda. By the later part of the 20th century, certainly by the 80s, however, we wind up with this very different drive towards coalitional politics underwritten by an emphasis on smaller associations and groupings. So what changes during this time period? So I think Kurtz really nicely outlines the continuing attempts by thinkers on the left, especially Harrington, to both understand why their initial impulse towards a unified party control and cohesion fails both at the level of legal or policy implementation, but even in terms of party unity, and also how Harrington and others tried to really adapt to the reality they see playing out around them and re-strategize. So this process itself is really interesting to see how this isn't working. What are we going to do? And you can see they're really at a loss for a little while. Jeff kind of highlights that nicely. And I think as Jeff explains nicely in the paper, and it didn't come out so clearly in the comments, but the problem, I think, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, Jeff, but the primary problem seems to be related to the decline of what we might simply call civic associations across the board. Those things that Tocqueville thought were so characteristic of Americans, and which we don't have a lot of anymore. We only see them in a very degraded state right now. So, when I was reading Jeff's paper, I kept thinking about Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, right? And it seems to me, 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, 2000, right? He got it right. Many of the groups and spaces where we used to meet with neighbors have vanished, right? Elks Clubs, Lions Clubs, Shriners, Spirits, these are all American examples, sorry, but they're largely gone, right? We used to join bowling leagues, now we bowl alone, or we don't bowl at all, but we stay home, we watch Netflix and we order in and we do our work online. Look at us, right? We're all in our own offices. I'm separate, right? So one story can be told, sort of a narrative of the disappearance of these things in the post-war late part of the 20th century in America. You have people like Putnam doing that at a sociological, political level. And then there are these sort of deeper philosophical critiques that I'm very interested in, right? These critiques that really take aim at the atomistic idea of the self, the same thing that Anastasia is so interested in, right? And you can, I would say this goes back to at least to Hobbes, right? And then you could tell a story about how this develops. I mean, I think we're familiar with that, right? So I guess the big question for Jeff is, how do these external events, which really are causal, right, in terms of the problems that people like Harrington face, right, at least as I see it, how are those going to be integrated into the paper? Are these in different chapters? Or it seems like your discussion of Harrington in particular could be enriched by this sort of side discussion, if you want to think of it in that way. So I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about that in your paper. For Anastasia, she wants to recover she says, the theory of revolutionary socialist vision of people like Fourier, Marx, Gandhi. And it's too bad we only got a little taste of what she does in the paper, because she actually covers lots of different thinkers in the course of writing the paper. She's trying to link lots of different thinkers, Fourier, Marx, Kollontai, Gandhi, and stressing elements that are common to all of them, right? So the elements she focuses on, right, revolutionary, socialist communes, or anti, or maybe a-capitalistic, right? They point to alternative orientations towards the means of production and living. Second, revolutionary socialist visions of the commune represent a form of liberation or freedom. This word comes up a lot in her paper, mostly in terms of liberation from the strictures of life under capitalism, along economic lines, social lines, or of course, gender lines. Now, of course, I think this approach is promising, right? As Mill notes, no revolutionary socialist, but as Mill notes, right, we need the example of extraordinary individuals to guide us in experiments to living. And these experiments, even if they fail, can help kind of illuminate the range of the possible. So, but I guess I have some questions for you about how the paper kind of plays this out. And these are both kind of questions and advice. Questions in the sense that, have you thought about integrating these things, and advice, and maybe you ought to think about integrating these things, right? So first off, I think you might consider beginning with a more general taxonomy of the idea of the commune, right? You focus on the revolutionary commune, but it seems, and you touched on this a little bit in your comments today, but it seems like briefly describing other alternative uses of the commune might help set what you want to think about into clearer relief. I think about, intentional communes in the United States, right? Other than noting that these sorts of communities nest inside of capitalism instead of actively opposing it, you don't expand on this. So how do these communities more specifically differ from the revolutionary commune? I mean, when I was in graduate school at the University of Virginia, I spent some time, a whole summer, at one of the oldest intentional communities in the United States, Twin Oaks, just outside of Charlottesville, Virginia. So you know it, right? And so the members of that community did, and I suspect that they still would, if you asked them, certainly say that they're anti-capitalist and they're revolutionary in a way, right? So can you draw some lines here, right? Or you can consider things like even religious communities, right? Many of these wouldn't claim the name of commune, but they function a lot like one. Just a little bit north of here in New Paltz, there's a very old and established Christian community, the Bruderhof, and they have no private property. They share all their meals in common. They reject both the atomistic, kind of philosophical idea of the liberal idea of the self, and they reject certainly market economics to the extent that they're able. They hold these both outside of what they're doing. They're nested within Christianity, but again, it'd be kind of interesting if you could draw some lines between these, right? So that's the first category. The second category is about definitional clarity, right? Or theoretical clarity, I guess more. You make some really strong claims. I think they're justified, claims about the liberatory potential of revolutionary communes, but I'd like to see you cash these out a little bit. What do you mean by freedom here, especially since the dominant understanding of the term circles here in the United States today around various iterations of negative liberty? You mean something different, right? Explaining precisely what that is would be really helpful. And I think the same goes, maybe this is a reiteration of the point I just made, but goes to the use of the term commune, right? These associations, of course, are partly contingent on the theoretical model in the historical moment, but I guess the question is, are there certain aspects of the commune that transcend the temporary? And I'm thinking here particularly about the often unexamined categories of time and commitment. They're linked together, of course, right? Strong communities above all else seem to require both of these things, time and commitment, or duration of membership, right? So what role do these categories, these often unspoken categories, play in stabilizing a particular institution? And it's not a long step from there to think about the role of traditions, not to get all Burkean on you, all right, and norms, right? But is there space for those in the revolutionary communes? The final point is I want to encourage you to deepen the your historical perspective on the commune, and perhaps just trouble a little bit your assertion of the conjunction of the commune and revolution after Paris, just after the Paris Commune, right? I'm sure you know this, right? But the term commune long predates the Paris Commune, right? Or it's explicitly revolutionary in the Marxist sense usage, right? It actually has medieval origins, right? So I was thinking of one early appearance of this, right? I think about the kind of overused tropes of the wars between Henry IV and Gregory VII, the investiture crisis, right after 1080. These were also civil wars, and they brought with them a delegitimization of the traditional power structures, and emperors and popes deposing and excommunicating each other, and rival bishops appearing sometimes in the same city. So during this time period, you see royal power just almost evaporate in some areas, or at least dramatically weakened, especially in the last decades of the 11th century. And it wasn't really revived again for quite a while, right? So what did cities do in this situation, right? Urban elders reacted by taking over the running of the cities themselves. And increasingly, they did so in organized collectivities, which by the second quarter of the 12th century were coming to be called communes. That's the first kind of clear instance of this word, right? So it's 12th century, right? These are city-states with collective leaderships. They're radically different political models, the rejection of older political models that we saw in the Carolingian world, right? They're made up of all or maybe most adult male city dwellers, of course, held together by oaths. There's a regular set of rotating ruling magistrates. Sometimes these guys are chosen by lottery. They're then validated and chosen by that collectivity, and they exercise kind of a de facto autonomy over the city in all aspects, right? It's all the basic elements of the early and central medieval governments, right? So now these aren't revolutionary communes in the Marxist sense, or in any of the senses you're using in your paper, but they do represent a pretty radical rejection of the political and social status quo. So maybe not revolutionary, but radical in that sense, right? And they also represent, you know, kind of quotidian terms, a marked increase in certain forms of freedom, at least for certain classes of people, right? So they're my questions on taxonomy, definitional clarity, and kind of historical breadth, right? As kind of, I think of myself as an intellectual historian, so I'm always interested in ideologies of things. So finally, just a couple of words on Spiros' paper, Philosophy as a Way of Life, which I found very interesting and fun to read. And I was thinking about, when I was reading Spiros' paper, I was thinking about how far we've come in our understanding of Leo Strauss. Spiros and I were talking before the panel started, and I think when I found a book by Strauss as an undergraduate in the library, one of my advisors said, "Oh, stay away from that guy, put the book back, right? Step away," right? And then, you go through this period in the early 2000s when a bunch of, Strauss's students, right, are connected with the George W. Bush administration, right? So, Strauss has a really checkered history, and for Americans, to the extent that they know about him, it's difficult to separate him from Alan Bloom or from the crazy guys in the Bush administration, right? But as Spiros pointed out to me at the beginning of our conversation together, the past 20 years has really also witnessed the publication of a number of really serious books, philosophical books, that are really trying to engage Strauss as a critical thinker in his own right, not kind of as an artifact of the political crypto-anarcho right in America. And a lot of these books have been, major works, some of which I've really enjoyed. I'm thinking notably here of Heinrich Mayer's Leo Strauss and the Theological Political Problem, which I'm sure you know, right? Or the Tanguay's biography of Leo Strauss, an intellectual biography. But, there are even, sorry, this is going on a little bit going off on a tangent a little bit here, but there are even kind of what I think of boutique texts, right? Like Jeffrey Vaughan's text, Leo Strauss and his Catholic readers. I mean, you've really made it as a major thinker when you get a book devoted to your, people responding to you who are just Catholics, right? All right, so what do these do? Well, they provide the important service of placing front and center what Strauss himself thought to be at the core of his own thought, the question of God and politics. Strauss repeatedly emphasized that the question of what is God, right, is coeval with philosophy, right? Paradoxically, Strauss at the same time went out of his way to emphasize that classical political philosophers did not frequently pronounce this really important question, right? This is from The City of Man and Man, he says this, right? Macris gives us this really interesting reading of this problem in Strauss's thought, beginning with its earliest incarnations as a philosophical theological problem while Strauss is still in Weimar, Germany, and then moving to a philosophical political problem in kind of the second phase of his thought when he's in America. There's a lot with which I agree here in Macris's paper, and he gives an excellent overview of the major nodes of thought throughout Strauss's life and explains how they tie into the theological political problem. So I have a couple of questions, but they're more questions of emphasis and omission than, a direct rejection of anything he's doing in his paper. Part of it, I feel like one of the things that needs to be highlighted a little bit here has to do with sort of the way I would imagine myself telling this story. I would place the emphasis, and it's not that Macris doesn't do this, right, but it just seems like it's a little dampened in his approach. I would place the emphasis on Strauss's concern with rationality across the board generally, right? And in my understanding, Strauss gradually came to see that the purported solution that modern rationalism offers in the place of theology was equally opposed to the claims of Socratic philosophy. Socratic philosophy, like biblical faith, emphasizes the indispensability and non-constructed nature of morality in general and justice in particular. Moreover, both of these affirm that morality must be tethered to a transcendent order that supplements and grounds morality. Lastly, and most important for Strauss, both the Bible and Socratic philosophy, in their own ways, claim that human beings are incapable of comprehending the whole. Modern rationalism attack on biblical faith is therefore, in the way that I understand it, equal to the attack on the foundations of Socratic philosophy for Strauss, right? To the extent that it was successful in discrediting the grounds of biblical faith, it was also successful in discrediting the foundations, and consequently, I think, the very possibility of Socratic philosophy. So As a result, Strauss starts to think about the only way in which you can get to an authentic return to orthodoxy, and by extension to Socratic philosophy, was to show that, contrary to its claims, modern philosophy had not proven that the world and human lives are perfectly intelligible without the assumption of a mysterious God. So, at the very least, I think this argument requires one to show that modern rationalism and science were not in possession of a complete and coherent philosophical system. So, to put it somewhat differently, Strauss recognized that a return to the shared ground of either orthodoxy or Socratic philosophy was truly impossible, only if modern philosophy had, in fact, succeeded in its effort to formulate a philosophical system. Here's a quote from Strauss: "A philosophical system in which man has to show himself theoretically and practically as the master of the whole world and the master of life." So with that in mind, I guess I have 3 questions for Spiros. The first one's just kind of a question of omission. So your review of Strauss's writing is pretty thorough, but I wondered why there wasn't a reference to Spinoza's Critique of Religion, his 1930 text, or at least I don't remember seeing one, which I would view as Strauss's first real sustained treatment of this matter, the relationship between philosophy, religion, and politics, and what role that plays in the development of liberal democracy. And I know Strauss distances himself from this a little later on in his life, but that seems like maybe you need something in there about that, right? Because it's such an early encounter for Strauss. The other one's sort of a structural question, and I'm wondering here how you would distinguish your reading of Strauss from other major interpreters. Like how, for example, is your approach different than Heinrich Meyer's, the scholar I mentioned before, right? I think it would be really nice to have at the beginning of the paper a little intellectual topography to kind of map things out a little bit and help clarify where you're going to place yourself in some of these debates. Right? And then the third question is really about this topic you brought up right at the end of your remarks about ancient liberalism, which I always find kind of a provocative and interesting phrase, right? It's bound to be kind of a confusing term to anybody who's not familiar with this discussion, right? And I think some sort of definition is needed. So if you want to talk a little bit about that, I think you use a synonym for that, Platonic liberalism, as well. So both of these things seem like they need some further explanation in the paper. So those are my comments. I'm hoping we can have a little bit of a discussion here. You people on the panel, you folks can respond to any or all of them, or to questions that I didn't raise, or you can raise questions to each other. But let's kind of open it up a little bit. And I don't know, would anyone like to take the first swing at a response or questions for fellow panelists?
I'll go, since I talked first, I'll go. I mean, I just have a couple of things to say. I mean, thank you very much for the comments, Jeff. They're very helpful. I would say on the point about Robert Putnam and that larger school of social criticism of sort of the neo-Tocquevillian school, I think you're right that that's very much in my mind, and I didn't put it very much in the paper. There was, I think, a brief mention of Theda Skocpol, but I didn't even mention Putnam. But I guess you're right that it would be helpful in developing the paper further to emphasize that. But and what I would hope to do, I guess, is show how the democratic socialist spin on that critique of the decline of associations adds something, right? That there's at least the seeds or the pieces of a democratic socialist alternative to what has usually been called the communitarian critique. I mean, if we think of American political theory in the 80s and thereabouts being mostly about the communitarian liberal debate, I would see people like Harrington and those in his circle as being an alternative response to liberalism and an alternative defense of the value of associations that emphasizes both the inegalitarian consequences of the decline of associational life and also the contributions that a specifically egalitarian politics can make to one hopes revival of associational life. I mean, I think that's the key thing that gets added, that maybe gets amplified if I do what you said and talk more about Putnam. But briefly, I wanted to say also, Spiros, I'd be very interested in hearing more about this idea of ancient liberalism. And Anastasia, whether I don't know if it's helpful or not, but along similar lines to what Jeff was saying about the medieval antecedents of what you were talking about, I kept thinking about medieval monasticism and the medieval monastic rule. I mean, the rule of Saint Benedict, I guess, is the best known one, but there would be others. But you could see that also as a, I mean, certainly the monastic rules are explicitly anti-egotistical. It's sort of a pedagogy and anti-egotism. And it had never occurred to me before, but you're right that there's some odd parallels between the revolutionary critique of the family and the monastery as an alternative structure of relationships. And then, of course, in the monastic tradition, you have actual existing communities that practice the, or at least claim to have practiced, aimed to practice the principle of from each according to ability, to each according to need. So all these interesting, I don't know if that's useful to your project or not, but there are a lot of parallels, antecedents, pre-echoes, if there is such a thing, before the 19th century. Possibly worth considering. But thank you both for your papers. They were very interesting.
Okay, I think I can respond briefly to some of your questions. Thank you for them. They were really interesting and very helpful for me to understand like the kind of like blind spots of that paper that I have like definitely thought a lot about, but I did not necessarily like include them into the paper. So about the like the first like big one, right? About like what are the other kinds of communes that are not like socialist communes, and could we call them communes? Yes, definitely. So the main reason why I insist on that, you know, idea of like socialist communes, like these two words, you know, coming together in one phrase, is exactly because, you know, there are numerous forms of other communities and other communes that exhibit like the same, you know, elements and the same forms of critique, and there is nothing unique or like particularly, you know, novel about like the socialist usage of communes in the 19th century, or, you know, it was not like a new discovery, as, you know, Marx and Lenin like thought about this or like interpreted this. And I try to combat that like vision of socialist communes too as something that belongs exclusively to like, say, like 19th century anti-capitalist movement. So it was not. It was not its like invention and its discovery. For this reason, it shares a lot of things in common with a lot of like religious communities, like religious communes, like medieval communes from like the city-states, right? Like from the tradition of city-state government. This is all true, but I think it's also possible to kind of like separate and distinguish what I mean and what I understand by socialist communes by, you know, kind of like clarifying or listing this like 4 types of criticism. So like the critique of individualism, like family, state, and economy. So only this like these 4 types of critique, they exist only in the socialist thought, so in the socialist tradition, like together. Of course, like they like different forms of that unity, like different elements of that you know, aggregation exist in the tradition, say, like of hippie communes in the 1960s, in like the movements that was composed of Fourier's followers and Owen's followers that were largely influenced the American political climate, like earlier in the 18th and 19th century. Yes, so some of this form, especially those that are related to the critique of individualism and the critique of family, they are very popular and I would say like influential in, you know, in other political traditions that are not necessarily identifying themselves like with socialism or like with communism. So that would be like my answer to the first question about the ideas of freedom and liberation that need to be clarified. so I do use freedom in the sense of positive freedom to construct the environment, like the political institutions or like social institutions that govern us. So I use freedom in that positive sense rather than the negative sense of freedom as the like freedom from constraints, like freedom from political authority, which is, I think it's an entirely just comment, an entirely just critique to the way I use like both communes and freedoms. Like there is too much emphasis on like the positive sides of the idea of the commune, whereas in fact communes, like socialist communes too, they carry like a serious danger of authoritarianism. They do have that issue that a lot of communes in the Soviet Union and a lot of like real communal experiments, they tend to like seriously limit that individual freedom of their members. And this is a part, again, like this is a part of that idea. This is a part of that project. So the danger of being illiberal is inherent into the idea of commune. So we shouldn't think about the idea of commune as that like positive, happy, wonderful institution. It does have its own dangers and its own limitation. So that's about freedom, and I think it should be said, probably more, right? Like about like the dangers to the individual freedom. Medieval communes. I think this is a great, wonderful advice to talk more about medieval communes. I would say that, like I've already said this a couple of times before, that like the word itself is not new, right? Like it wasn't invented by the Paris Commune. Neither it was invented by Marx and Engels, but they do kind of like even Marx. When he's talking about like the Paris Commune, he like constantly insists on the fact that the Paris Commune has nothing in common with medieval Italian city communes, because Italian medieval city communes, they did not criticize economic inequality. They were not like critical of the distinction between the poor and the rich, between like aristocratic class and the peasantry. So they only like reinforced that like inequality that was apparent in otherwise, say, like participatory governance of Italian city-states. So that is the type of criticism that Marx and Engels are focusing on. And I think, yeah, like I could say more about this. I do agree about this. Yeah. Thank you.
Spiros, what do you got?
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Thank you very much for your comments. And thanks to the other guys for the papers. If I could say some things concerning the other papers, Jeff, I don't know if I have minutes to say some things.
Yeah, I want
one or two questions or some observations. For example,
under that time limit. So maybe
okay.
as you
I'll
feel.
try to be on time. Okay, first of all, I like Jeff your idea concerning socialism as an anti-modern, you said, if I'm not wrong, model. And for me, this is a critical point when it comes to socialism. If we want to keep the spirit of socialism open, so to speak, we need to see socialism as an anti-modern, as an alternative, so to speak, okay, model again, capitalism and things like that. So I like very much. Now, when it comes to your paper, Anastasia, I agree with Jeff that you need to build a kind of typology when it comes to communities, communes, and commons, and things like that. Okay, and I have a question here, or an observation. If you think that commune has, on the one hand, a feminist aspect, okay, which is very critical. You said some things about Fourier, if I'm not wrong. And on the other hand, I would like to know if you see the utopian aspect of commune, because as we know, Marx, for example, challenges very hard utopian socialism and things like that. This is very critical for me to know if commune has a utopian aspect, and how we can, according to this analysis, how we can distinguish this typology, this type of community from something else. So the utopian aspect, and the second one is the feminist aspect. And now I'm going straight to Jeff comments. Thanks a lot. First of all, Jeff, let's say that Spinoza is the modern Socrates. So for Strauss, Spinoza is the point of departure. Of course, it was only a matter of time and space for me. Okay, I didn't have the proper time to say more things, but to the extent that I'm talking all the time about the theological political we know very well that Spinoza is the first modern thinker. Okay, that brought to forward this kind of analysis with political theology, theological political problem, and so on. So let's say that Spinoza is the modern Socrates. Let's say that for Strauss, Spinoza was the starting point, the inspiration, in other words, concerning the problem of Socrates and so on. So as far as your second comment, in my paper, I would say, I dare to say, not in my paper, no, not only in this paper, but in my academic work, I'm trying to bring to the fore, to bring to light this tension. This is a critical word. This is the proper word here. This tension between philosophy and politics, or the man and the city. And so this kind of analysis, Jeff, leads us to the third question of yours, the third comments, which is about the meaning or the definition of ancient liberalism. And you said, Geoff, something about this. So what is this? What is this kind of liberalism, and how we can distinguish ancient liberalism from modern liberalism? Paraphrasing Cornelius Castoriadis, I would say that we need an adjective here. I was talking about a tension. So the answer, the critical answer, is the tragic tension. Castoriadis says that Athens, or the democratic polis, or the city of Athens, is the exemplification of the ontotheological tragedy of polis per se. So for me, the answer concerning ancient liberalism is this tragic balance, this tragic equilibrium, so to speak, between free speech in the sense of philosophizing, and on the other side, the faith, the common faith of the city. At the end of the day, as we have seen in the case of Socrates, at the end of the day, city is above individual. Socrates, very consciously, he decides to sacrifice himself for the sake of the city. So he puts himself beneath the common faith of the polis. This is the meaning for me when it comes to ancient liberalism. It is this tragic balance between me as an individual, who need all the time to express myself in a free way by philosophizing in agora, and on the other time to take seriously into account the common destiny of political community, which is city or polis. So this is a working definition, let's say, Jeff, when it comes to ancient liberalism. Thanks a lot.
Good. Well, thank you each. I'm going to ask you all to stay on the line just for a moment so we can talk, but I think I need to end the recording so it fits into the slot that the conference is going to put it into. Let me do that. So thank you all for your papers. Very interesting. Thanks for the discussion. I wish we had more time for the discussion. Okay.